In 1999, KB Toys operated more stores than Toys R Us. Over 1,300 of them, tucked into nearly every shopping mall in America. Not a niche player, not a regional favorite. The second largest toy retailer in the country. Picture the mall on a Saturday afternoon. The red clearance bins spilling over with marked down action figures. Kids on their knees digging through them for an hour, spending a week's allowance on something that felt like treasure. The KB storefront wedged between the food court and the department store anchor, lit up and loud, impossible to walk past without stopping. Every Christmas, pop-up KB counters appeared inside Sears stores, selling out before the lights came down in January. By February 2009, all of it was gone. Every store closed. 87 years of history, liquidated in a matter of weeks. What actually killed KB Toys wasn't Amazon, and it wasn't Walmart. It was a decision made in a boardroom in 2002, one most customers never heard about, and one the company never recovered from. Harry and Joseph Kaufman were not toy men, they were candy men. And for 24 years, that was the whole of their ambition. The brothers ran a wholesale candy business out of Pittsfield, Massachusetts, a mill town in the Berkshires, where the work was steady and the margins were thin. It was 1922 when they started, and for 2 decades their trucks moved sugar and chocolate to corner stores across New England. Nothing more, nothing less. There was no grand vision yet. There was just a business run carefully by 2 brothers who understood credit, inventory, and the slow arithmetic of small-town commerce. The turn came in 1946, and it came sideways, the way most turning points in retail history actually do. A client owed the Kaufmans money. A wholesale toy company in over its head and unable to pay off its debt. Rather than write off the loss, the brothers took the toy business itself as payment. It was not a plan, it was a settlement. But within 2 years, the Kaufmans had made their decision. The candy wholesale operation was closed, and Kaufman Brothers would sell toys, full-time for good. What they built next was not glamorous. There was no flagship store on a grand boulevard, no press coverage, no fanfare. Kaufman Brothers operated as a wholesaler first, supplying toys to 5 and dime stores and small retailers across the Northeast through the 1950s and 1960s, learning the toy trade from the inside, which items moved at Christmas, which sat on shelves, which manufacturers could be trusted and which couldn't. It was an education in the unglamorous mechanics of getting a toy from a factory floor into a child's hands, and it would prove to be the exact education the Kaufmans needed for what came next. That next step arrived in the early 1970s, when the company pivoted from wholesale supplier to direct retailer, opening stores under the name KB Toy and Hobby, a name built quite literally from the initials K and B Kaufman Brothers, stitched into something that sounded friendly enough to put on a storefront sign. The first KB stores were modest by design, compact spaces built for the covered shopping mall, an American retail format that was, at that exact moment, exploding across the country. Where department stores needed acreage, KB needed a few thousand square feet and a location near the mall's main corridor. Walk into one of those early stores and the appeal was immediate and unpretentious. Shelves packed floor to ceiling with games, dolls, and die-cast cars. No frills, no dressing up the experience. Just volume, variety, and prices a working-class family could afford without a second thought. The Kaufmans understood something that would define the company for the next 20 years. They weren't selling toys to wealthy families with big backyards and big budgets. They were selling to the families walking through the mall on a Tuesday evening, the ones for whom a $5 toy was still a real purchase, one that mattered. That was the whole of the founders' belief, distilled. Put affordable toys directly in the path of ordinary families, in the place where those families already spent their Saturdays. It wasn't a complicated philosophy. It also happened to be exactly right for the moment America was entering. A moment when the shopping mall was about to become the new town square, and KB Toy and Hobby was standing right there, waiting for it. By the mid-1980s, the mall had become the center of American childhood, and KB, soon simply KB, was one of its permanent fixtures. This was the decade and the one that followed it, the 1980s bleeding into the 1990s, when the chain stopped being just a toy store and became a ritual, one repeated in nearly identical form in shopping centers from Ohio to California. The ritual worked like this. A family arrived at the mall with no particular plan to buy anything, but the walk to the department store, or the movie theater, or the food court passed directly by KB's storefront, and the pull was almost involuntary. Inside, past the new releases, stacked at full price near the entrance, sat the chain's true signature, the clearance bins. Deep red plastic tubs packed to overflowing with discontinued action figures, incomplete board games, off-brand dolls, and marked-down toy cars, all priced low enough that a child's own allowance could cover it. Kids didn't browse the bins. They dug through them, elbow deep, for 20 minutes at a time, hunting for the one figure that had escaped everyone else's notice. It was treasure hunting disguised as retail, and an entire generation of American kids remembers exactly what that cardboard and plastic smell felt like. Former shoppers recalling the chain decades later in online forums and nostalgia groups describe almost the same scene independently of one another. A parent standing by the register with visible patience running thin, a child cross-legged on the floor in front of the bins, absolutely certain that the next item pulled out would be the one worth having. It wasn't really about what was found. It was about the hunting. The occasion mattered as much as the store itself. A birthday meant a trip to KB with a few dollars to spend freely, no supervision required. A small taste of independence for a child not yet old enough for much else. A good report card sometimes meant the same reward. And every December, KB became something closer to a seasonal institution. The chain didn't just wait for holiday shoppers to come to its mall locations. It went to them, setting up temporary pop-up counters inside Sears department stores each Christmas. KB-branded kiosks selling toys directly on Sears' own sales floor. For a company built on modest, no-frills stores, this was a genuine cultural footprint. Two retail giants, one selling appliances and clothing, the other selling toys, sharing floor space during the one season that mattered most. Employees who worked the counters during those Decembers describe a different side of the same golden era. Not a magical treasure hunt, but 12-hour shifts, register lines stretching past the end caps, and stock rooms emptied faster than trucks could refill them. It was retail at its most demanding, and also, by most accounts, retail at its most alive. The chain's growth reflected the intensity of those years. Sales climbed from $1.1 billion in 1996 to $1.6 billion just 2 years later, and the kbkids.com website launched in the late 1990s, an early bet that the same treasure hunt energy could translate online. What made the KB experience impossible to replace wasn't its selection. Toys R Us, its biggest rival, had more inventory and bigger stores by far. What KB offered instead was proximity and affordability. It didn't require a special car trip to a freestanding superstore on the edge of town. It was already there, inside the mall families visited anyway, priced for allowance money rather than parental budgets. For a working and middle-class kid growing up in the 1980s or 1990s, KB wasn't the toy store their parents drove them to. It was the one they wandered into on their own, red bins and all, while the rest of the family shopped somewhere else in the same building. By 1999, that formula had carried the chain to roughly 124 stores nationwide, a peak that made KB, for one brief moment, the second largest toy retailer in the United States. Nobody standing in front of those clearance bins that year had any reason to believe the company was anything but permanent. But 60 miles away, in a boardroom that had nothing to do with clearance bins or Christmas kiosks, a decision was already being prepared, one that would determine in the space of a single year whether any of this would survive at all. The Kaufman family sold the company in 1981, and with that sale, KB Toys entered the first of several ownership changes that would define the next 2 decades. A company built once by two brothers with a candy truck now passed between corporations that had never sold a single toy. The buyer was Melville Corporation, a sprawling retail conglomerate that would later become the parent company of CBS. Melville didn't buy KB Toys because it loved toys. It bought KB Toys because the chain's small footprint, mall-based model was cheap to replicate and fast to scale. And Melville had the capital and the real estate relationships to do exactly that. Under Melville's ownership through the 1980s, KB expanded aggressively into malls across the country, riding the same wave that was filling shopping centers with anchor department stores and specialty retailers nationwide. The corporate playbook was simple and repeatable. Identify a mall with strong foot traffic, secure a small storefront near the main corridor, stock it with the same core inventory and the same red clearance bins that had worked everywhere else, and open the doors. It required no franchise partners, no local operators, no negotiation with independent owners. Every store answered to the same headquarters, which meant growth could move as fast as leases could be signed. And it moved fast. By the mid-1990s, KB Toy stores had become a near-universal fixture of the American mall, present in shopping centers in nearly every state, from major metropolitan malls to modest regional centers in towns that had little else in the way of retail. In 1996, Melville sold the chain to Consolidated Stores Corporation, the company known today as Big Lots, for roughly $300 million. It was a deal built on a shared logic. Consolidated Stores had built its own business on selling closeout and discount merchandise, and KB's clearance bin culture fit that model almost perfectly. Under Consolidated's ownership, KB leaned even further into closeouts, at times running separate storefronts side by side in the same mall, one selling new merchandise at full price, the other dedicated entirely to discounted overstock. It was an unusual arrangement, but it worked, and it pushed the chain's sales past the billion-dollar mark for the first time. The most aggressive expansion move came in 1994, when KB launched Toyworks, a chain of freestanding, big-box format stores built to compete directly with Toys R Us on its own turf. For a company that had spent 70 years perfecting the small mall storefront, this was a real departure. Larger footprints, more parking, more inventory per store, all built to prove that KB could hold its ground against the industry's biggest player outside the shopping mall entirely. It was an ambitious bet on a format the company had never truly mastered, and it stretched the company's operational focus in two directions at once: the tightly run mall stores that had built the brand, and a newer, bigger format still finding its footing. Behind the growth numbers were real people navigating real pressure. Store managers hired in the 1980s and 1990s describe a workplace that rewarded speed and consistency above almost everything else. Inventory had to move, clearance bins had to be restocked, and each store, regardless of size, was expected to hit numbers set by a headquarters most employees would never see in person. For some, the growth years meant genuine opportunity. A job at a mall kiosk could become a store manager position, and a store manager position could become a district role as the company added new locations faster than it could always staff them. For others, particularly as ownership changed hands every few years, expansion meant something closer to instability. New corporate priorities, new reporting structures, and new pressure to hit sales targets that had been set by executives with no connection to the stores on the ground. What's striking about KB's expansion, in hindsight, is how little of it depended on any single visionary decision. Each ownership group, the Kaufmans, then Melville, then Consolidated Stores, expanded the chain because the mall-based model kept generating returns, not because anyone was building toward a long-term identity for the brand. The chain grew by inertia as much as by strategy, adding stores because the format was still profitable, without ever fully resolving what kind of retailer it wanted to be: a discount closeout chain, a mall specialty store, or a big box competitor to Toys R Us. All three identities existed inside the company at once by the late 1990s. That contradiction hadn't cost the company anything yet. Sales were climbing, store counts were climbing, and within a few years, KB Toys would reach a scale no toy retailer outside of Toys R Us itself had ever achieved. But a company that had changed owners 3 times in 20 years, each one layering its own priorities onto the last, was about to attract the attention of a very different kind of buyer. One whose plans for KB Toys had nothing to do with clearance bins, mall traffic, or toys at all. By 1999, KB Toys had reached a scale that put it in a category almost no other toy retailer in American history had occupied. Roughly 1,224 stores stood open across the country, spanning nearly every state in the Union, a footprint that made KB, for one moment, the second largest toy retailer in the United States, trailing only Toys R Us itself. For a company that had started as a two-brother candy wholesale operation in a mill town in the Berkshires, it was an almost improbable arrival. The scale showed up in the numbers, but it lived in something harder to measure. KB Toys had become a genuinely national experience, one that looked and felt nearly identical, whether a family walked into a store in a suburban Ohio mall, a shopping center outside Phoenix, or a regional mall in upstate New York. The red clearance bins were the same. The floor-to-ceiling shelving was the same. The layout near the mall's main corridor was the same. In an era before every retail experience had been homogenized by online shopping, that consistency meant something. A family moving across the country, relocating for a new job or a new life, could walk into a KB Toys in an unfamiliar town and feel, for a few minutes, like nothing had changed at all. Nowhere was that national footprint more visible than during the holiday season, when KB's temporary pop-up counters opened inside Sears stores across the country each December. It was a genuinely unusual arrangement in American retail, one national chain operating storefronts inside another. And it meant that even shoppers who never set foot in an actual KB store still encountered the brand every Christmas, tucked inside the department store where they were already buying everything else on their list. For a company built on small mall storefronts, those Sears kiosks were proof that KB Toys had become bigger than its own real estate footprint. Sales told the same story from a different angle. The chain pulled in $1.1 billion in 1996, and by 1998, that figure had climbed to $1.6 billion, a jump that reflected not just more stores, but a company operating at the peak of its cultural relevance. The launch of kbkids.com in the late 1990s was, in its way, an admission of just how central the brand had become to how American families thought about buying toys. KB wasn't chasing the internet out of desperation. It was expanding into it the way a confident, dominant retailer expands into anything new. For employees who worked the floor during those peak years, the scale of the operation was felt daily, not abstractly. A district manager overseeing a dozen mall stores in the late 1990s wasn't managing a struggling chain looking for its footing. They were managing outposts of a company that seemed to be everywhere at once, hiring seasonal staff by the thousands every November, restocking shelves that emptied within days of the holiday rush beginning. There was a particular kind of pride that came with working for a company that size at that moment. It didn't feel like a company in decline. It felt, to nearly everyone standing inside it, like a company that had arrived. That feeling passed down through families in a way few retailers ever manage. A parent who had dug through KB's clearance bins as a kid in the 1980s was, by the late 1990s, doing the exact same thing with their own children. The ritual repeating itself almost unchanged across a generation. Grandparents mailed KB gift certificates. Parents budgeted allowance money around Saturday trips to the mall. Children learned, the way children always do, that this particular red and white storefront was where the good stuff was, even when they couldn't have explained why. It was this kind of generational transmission, more than any single sales figure, that made KB Toys feel less like a business and more like a fixture of American family life. The kind of place people assumed would simply always be there. What could possibly threaten a company operating at that scale, with that kind of loyalty, at the exact moment it had become the second largest toy retailer in the country? The answer had nothing to do with competition from Walmart, nothing to do with the internet, and nothing to do with changing tastes among American kids. It arrived instead in the form of a buyer, a private equity firm out of Boston, closing in on a deal that would value the company at $305 million, with plans for KB Toys that no shopper standing at those clearance bins could have possibly imagined. In the year 2000, the news reaching KB Toys store managers and mall shoppers alike sounded, on its surface, like good news. Bain Capital, a private equity firm based in Boston, had agreed to acquire KB Toys for roughly $305 million. To anyone reading the headline in a trade publication, it looked like validation. A respected investment firm putting real money behind a chain that had just posted its strongest sales in company history. Nobody standing in front of the clearance bins that year had any reason to feel uneasy. Nobody working a register during the 1999 holiday rush knew that anything had changed at all. That, in hindsight, was exactly the problem. Private equity acquisitions do not typically announce their intentions to the public, and this one was no different. Bain Capital's plan for KB Toys followed a pattern that had already played out at other American retailers and would play out at many more in the years to come. Acquire the company using a combination of cash and borrowed debt, place that debt onto the company's own books rather than the buyer's, and extract value from the business as quickly as possible. Within 2 years of the acquisition, Bain Capital and its co-investors authorized a dividend payout to themselves and other shareholders totaling roughly $85 million. A sum pulled directly out of a company that was, at that exact moment, already carrying the weight of the debt used to buy it. To put that number in perspective, KB Toys had been purchased for $305 million. Within roughly 2 years, its new owners had already recovered more than a quarter of that purchase price back out of the company, not through growth or new stores, but through a direct payout financed largely by KB's own borrowed debt. The company that remained afterward was the same one shoppers walked into every weekend. Same red bins, same mall storefronts, same seasonal Sears kiosks. But its financial foundation had been quietly and substantially weakened, in a way no customer standing at the register could see. Meanwhile, the retail landscape outside the mall was shifting in ways that would have tested even a financially healthy company. Walmart and Target were expanding their own toy departments aggressively, undercutting KB on price with a scale KB's mall-based footprint could never match. Mall traffic itself, the lifeblood of KB's entire business model, had begun a slow, uneven decline as American shoppers increasingly gravitated towards standalone big-box stores and strip malls with easier parking. None of this alone would have been fatal. Retailers had weathered shifting competition before, but a company now carrying significantly more debt than it had in 1999, with less cash cushion to absorb a downturn, had far less room to adapt. The people working inside KB Toys during these years experienced the strain long before any headline explained why it existed. Store managers noticed inventory arriving later, in smaller shipments, with less variety than in years past. District staff noticed that requests for store renovations or fixture repairs, once approved routinely, were increasingly delayed or denied outright. None of it looked like a crisis. It looked at first like ordinary belt-tightening, the kind of minor frustration retail employees are trained to absorb without asking too many questions. A worn carpet here, a broken shelf left unrepaired there. Small things easy to explain away individually and nearly impossible to explain away all at once. Corporate leadership, for its part, gave no public indication that anything was wrong. KB Toys entered the 2003 holiday season presenting itself the same way it always had. Clearance bins stocked, Sears kiosks assembled, seasonal staff hired by the thousands. There was no warning issued to franchise partners because KB had none. There was no public statement acknowledging strain because none was required. The company's finances and the decisions being made about them existed entirely behind a wall that ordinary shoppers and even most ordinary employees had no way to see through. That 2003 holiday season would turn out to be the moment everything finally came due. Consumer spending on toys fell short of projections that Christmas, and for a retailer already carrying debt it had never asked to take on, a single disappointing season was enough to tip the balance from strained to unsustainable. The company that had looked just 4 years earlier like the second largest toy retailer in America, flush with cash, expanding confidently, seemingly permanent, was now weeks away from filing for bankruptcy protection. How does a company with $1.6 billion in annual sales, at the absolute height of its cultural relevance, end up unable to survive one difficult Christmas? The answer wasn't hiding in KB's sales figures or in its competition or in the shopping habits of American families. It was sitting in a set of financial documents from 2002, Documents that no customer digging through a clearance bin that December had any reason to ever read. To understand what happened to KB Toys, it helps to understand how a leveraged buyout actually works. Because the mechanics, stripped of financial jargon, are almost shockingly simple. When Bain Capital acquired KB Toys in 2000 for roughly $305 million, only a portion of that purchase price came from Bain's own investment funds. The rest was financed through debt, loans borrowed against KB Toys itself, then placed onto the company's own balance sheet rather than Bain's. This is a standard structure in private equity, used across countless acquisitions, and it is not by itself an act of wrongdoing. What made KB Toys' case notable was what happened next. Within roughly 2 years of the acquisition, Bain Capital and its co-investors authorized a special dividend payment to themselves, totaling approximately $85 million. That payout was drawn substantially from the company's own resources and its borrowing capacity, meaning KB Toys, in effect, took on additional financial obligation in order to pay its new owners back a significant portion of what they had just spent to acquire it. Roughly 2 years after the deal closed, more than a quarter of the original purchase price had already been recovered by the buyers, while the underlying business, the stores, the employees, the inventory, the leases, was left carrying the resulting debt load with no corresponding increase in revenue to support it. Bain Capital's co-founder was Mitt Romney, who would go on to run for president in 2012. By the time of the KB Toys acquisition in 2000, Romney had already stepped away from day-to-day management at Bain to lead the Salt Lake City Olympic Organizing Committee, though he retained certain financial interests tied to Bain entities during this period, a fact that would resurface as a point of political scrutiny more than a decade later during his presidential campaign. The documented record of the KB Toys transaction centers on Bain Capital as an institution and the executives who structured the deal. The company's finances were not managed by any single individual acting alone, but by a firm operating according to a financial strategy it had used, with variations at other acquisitions as well. The consequences of that strategy showed up first in places invisible to customers. Store renovation budgets, once approved as a matter of routine maintenance, were increasingly delayed or denied. Inventory orders, particularly for new releases rather than closeout merchandise, arrived smaller and later than they had in previous years. For a chain whose entire appeal rested on shelves that always looked full and clearance bins that always seemed to have something new worth digging for. These were not cosmetic problems. They were early erosion of the exact experience that had built the brand in the first place. Store-level employees, the people who had no visibility into boardroom decisions in Boston, absorbed the consequences directly. A store that had once received weekly restocking might now wait 2 weeks between shipments. A worn carpet or a broken fixture, once repaired within days, might now sit unaddressed for months, quietly changing how a store looked and felt to the families walking through it. None of it was announced, none of it was explained. It simply accumulated, one small deferred decision at a time, until stores that had once felt vibrant began to feel, in the words of some former employees describing that period years later, tired. By the fall of 2003, KB Toys was heading into the most important selling season of its fiscal year, carrying a debt load its 1999 self had never known, with less operational cushion than it had ever had at any point in its history. Corporate leadership gave no outward sign that the company was approaching a breaking point. Seasonal staff were hired, Sears kiosks were assembled and stocked. Advertising ran as it always had. To a shopper walking into a KB Toys that November, nothing about the experience signaled that anything was fundamentally different from the year before. But the 2003 holiday season underperformed, and for a company with little remaining financial cushion, underperformance was no longer something that could simply be absorbed and forgotten by January. The gap between what KB Toys needed that Christmas season to deliver and what it actually delivered was the moment insiders would later point to as the tipping point. Not because the shortfall itself was catastrophic in isolation, but because the debt sitting underneath the company meant there was no longer any room left to absorb a disappointing season the way a healthier retailer might have. In the months that followed, as the company's financial position became public through bankruptcy filings, creditors moved to hold the previous ownership accountable. Litigation was filed alleging that the 2002 dividend payment had been authorized irresponsibly, extracted from a company whose underlying business and broader retail environment were already showing signs of strain at the time the payout was approved. Bain Capital ultimately settled one such lawsuit for $27 million. dollars. A separate suit brought by Big Lots, KB's former parent company, was dismissed by the courts. What the documented record makes clear, without need for speculation, is the sequence of events itself. A company acquired in 2000, a substantial dividend extracted from that company by 2002, and a bankruptcy filing by January 2004. A timeline of roughly 4 years from purchase to collapse, unfolding almost entirely out of view of the customers who kept walking into KB toy stores, digging through the same red clearance bins, with no idea that the ground underneath the company they trusted had already shifted. The employees closest to the stores felt the consequences long before any customer did, but the customers would not be shielded for long. The first public sign that something had gone deeply wrong at KB Toys was only weeks away, and when it came, it would arrive not as a quiet financial filing, but as store closure notices taped to the windows of malls across the country. On January 14, 2004, KB Toys filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. For most customers, the news arrived not through a press conference or a corporate statement, but through something far more direct: a printed notice taped to the inside of a store's glass door, or a folded flyer left at the register announcing that the location would be closing for good. The scale of what followed was staggering for a company that, just 5 years earlier, had been opening new stores by the dozens. More than 600 locations closed in the months following the filing, nearly half of the roughly 1,131 stores KB Toys operated at the time. Court filings disclosed the company's financial position with a clarity that had never existed publicly before. Assets of roughly $507 million set against liabilities of $461 million. A balance sheet that, on paper, still looked survivable, but one that left almost no room to absorb further strain. More than 3,400 employees lost their jobs in a single wave of closures, most of them with only weeks of notice, some with less. For the employees who kept their positions at the roughly 630 stores that remained open, the bankruptcy filing brought a different kind of disorientation. Store managers who had spent years building relationships with regular customers now had to explain over and over why the store down the road at another mall had shut its doors while theirs stayed open. An explanation that came down to numbers determined at a level none of them had any part of. Corporate morale, by multiple later accounts from former employees, cratered during this period. People kept showing up for shifts at stores that might or might not exist in 6 months, restocking shelves and running registers with no real certainty about their own job security. Customers experienced the collapse differently, but just as viscerally. Liquidation sales at the closing locations drew crowds that hadn't set foot in a KB Toys in years. Shoppers who had aged out of the clearance bin ritual as children now walking through the same stores as adults, picking through what remained on shelves increasingly stripped bare, watching discount signage climb from 20% off to 50, then 70 as the closing date approached. For longtime shoppers, it was an unsettling inversion of the experience that had defined the brand. The treasure hunt through discounted merchandise, once a source of childhood delight, now signaling the end of the store itself. KB Toys emerged from Chapter 11 in September 2005, restructured and considerably smaller, now under roughly 90% ownership of a different private equity firm, Prentice Capital Management. On paper, it was a second chance, a leaner company, freed from a portion of its debt, with a slimmed-down footprint of stores considered to have the strongest sales potential. For a moment, it looked as though the worst had passed. KB Toys had survived its first bankruptcy. Few companies get a second act after a filing like that. Fewer still would need one again so soon. The years following the 2005 restructuring gave KB Toys no real room to recover its footing. The retail environment that had strained the company before its first bankruptcy had not improved. Mall traffic continued its slow national decline, and competition from Walmart, Target, and a growing number of online retailers only intensified. Then in the summer of 2007, a new crisis arrived that had nothing to do with debt or private equity at all. A wave of toy recalls swept the industry after several popular products, including some carried by KB Toys, were found to contain lead contamination, part of a broader scare that shook consumer confidence in toy safety that year. For a company already operating with thin margins, the recalls added both direct costs and a chilling effect on holiday sales during a season the chain could not afford to lose. By November 2007, the company announced it would close another 156 stores, a clear signal that the 2005 restructuring had not been enough to stabilize the business long term. Toy industry sales overall had remained flat for 3 straight years, hovering around $22 billion nationally, offering no organic growth for any retailer in the category to lean on, let alone one still recovering from a bankruptcy just 2 years earlier. The financial crisis that began unfolding in 2008 delivered the final blow. Consumer spending contracted sharply across the country that fall, and for a retailer already weakened by years of debt, declining mall traffic, and a damaging product recall, there was no reserve left to draw on. In December 2008, KB Toys filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the second time in 5 years, and this time, there would be no restructuring, no second act. The company announced it would liquidate entirely. Liquidation sales began in the final weeks of 2008 and stretched into early 2009. And for the employees working those last shifts, the experience was markedly different from the first round of closures in 2004. There was no ambiguity left to hold on to, no remaining stores to point to as evidence the brand might survive in some form. Store fixtures were sold off along with the inventory. Signage came down. Registers that had rung up holiday purchases for 80-some years processed their final transactions, often to shoppers who had come specifically because they'd heard this really was the end. On February 9th, 2009, the last of KB Toys' 461 remaining stores closed for good. 87 years after Harry and Joseph Kaufman began selling candy out of a wholesale operation in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and 63 years after a client's unpaid debt accidentally turned them into toy dealers, the company they built no longer existed in any operating form. Coverage of the closure in the business press focused mostly on the mechanics of the bankruptcy, asset values, creditor claims, the mechanics of the liquidation process. It was the kind of coverage bankruptcies usually receive: brief, procedural, quickly forgotten by anyone not directly affected. But for the millions of people who had once dug through those red clearance bins as children, the news landed differently, even if most of them wouldn't hear about it directly at all. They would simply notice, at some point in the following years, that the KB Toys at their old mall was no longer there, replaced by another store, or standing empty, or simply absent from a shopping center they hadn't visited in years. There would be no single moment of public mourning, just a slow, quiet realization, repeated individually in malls across the country, that something that had once felt permanent had, in fact, been gone for a while. The KB Toys name did not disappear entirely when the last store closed in February 2009. Toys R Us, the very company that had once been KB's biggest rival on mall real estate and shelf space, acquired the KB Toys intellectual property out of the bankruptcy, holding the brand and its trademarks without ever reopening a single physical location under the name. It was a quiet, almost administrative footnote to the story, a competitor absorbing what remained of a rival it had spent decades competing against, not to revive it, but simply because the brand still carried enough recognition to be worth owning. That footnote took a sharply ironic turn less than a decade later. In 2018, Toys R Us itself filed for bankruptcy and liquidated its own stores nationwide, undone by strikingly similar forces. A leveraged buyout years earlier had loaded the company with billions in debt. Competition from big box retailers and online shopping had eroded its market position, and the combination left no room to survive a downturn. The company that had outlasted KB Toys and briefly owned its remains met nearly the same fate less than 10 years later. In 2016, ownership of the KB Toys brand passed again, this time to Strategic Marks LLC, a firm that specializes in acquiring dormant retail trademarks. Nostalgic brand names with no operating stores behind them, kept alive primarily through licensing and limited online sales rather than any real retail presence. The broader lesson that KB Toys' collapse offered the retail industry had little to do with toys specifically, and everything to do with how a company could be destroyed by decisions that never touched its stores, its products, or its customers at all. KB Toys did not lose to Walmart on price, and it did not lose to Amazon on convenience, though both of those pressures were real and growing throughout the 2000s. What it could not survive was a debt structure imposed on it in 2000 and 2002, one that left the company with no financial cushion at the exact moment the broader retail environment began to shift. In the years and decades that followed, retail analysts and business journalists would return to KB Toys repeatedly as an early, clear example of a pattern that played out at dozens of other American retailers. Private equity ownership, debt finance acquisitions, dividend payouts extracted from the acquired company itself, and bankruptcies that followed not from bad products or bad locations, but from balance sheets that had been weakened before the real competition ever arrived. The communities built around KB toy stores absorbed the collapse in ways that outlasted the headlines. Malls that had counted on KB as a reliable long-term tenant now had vacant storefronts to fill. At a moment when mall traffic nationwide was already declining and fewer retailers were looking to expand into that kind of space. For thousands of former employees, store clerks, seasonal hires, district managers who had built entire careers moving up through the company, the closures meant starting over in a retail industry that was itself contracting, with fewer toy-specific jobs available anywhere to move into. Some found positions at Toys R Us in the years before that company's own collapse. Others left retail altogether, taking what they had learned managing inventory and staff into entirely different industries. What KB Toys ultimately left behind was not a cautionary tale in the simple sense, not a story about a company that failed to innovate or misjudged its customers or fell behind changing tastes. Its clearance bins were still full in 2003. Its stores were still crowded every December. The company that shoppers walked into right up until the bankruptcy filing was, in every way visible from the sales floor, the same company that had built loyal following over 3 decades. The failure happened somewhere else entirely. In financial documents signed years before most customers or employees had any reason to worry, decisions that determined the company's fate long before its stores ever showed a sign of trouble. What does it mean that a business can be loved by its customers, profitable on its sales floor, and staffed by people proud of the work they did, and still be destroyed by choices made entirely outside of that store, by people who never had to watch the doors close? Somewhere in America tonight, someone in their 40s or 50s is trying to describe a feeling to their own child and failing to find the right words for it. They're trying to explain what it felt like to kneel in front of a deep red plastic bin inside a mall toy store, elbow deep in discontinued action, figures, and incomplete board games, hunting for the one thing worth taking home. The child listening has never seen a store like that. They will never dig through those bins themselves. But something in the way the memory is told, the specific brightness in the voice, the small laugh at the end, tells them that whatever this place was, it mattered. KB Toys was never the biggest toy store in America, and it was rarely the best stocked. Toys R Us had more selection. Department stores had bigger toy departments during the holidays. What KB had instead was proximity. It was already there, inside the mall a family visited anyway, on a Tuesday evening or a Saturday afternoon that had no particular plan behind it. A few dollars of allowance money went further inside those clearance bins than almost anywhere else a kid could spend it alone, without a parent standing over their shoulder making the decision for them. For a lot of American children growing up in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, KB Toys wasn't the store their parents took them to. It was the one they were finally old enough to walk into by themselves. That small taste of independence was the real product KB Toys was selling. More than any individual toy on its shelves, a 10-year-old handed a $5 bill, and permission to wander off alone for 20 minutes was being trusted with something that felt, at the time, enormous. The store didn't need to be large or luxurious for that to work. It needed to be affordable, familiar, and within walking distance of wherever the rest of the family was shopping. Generation after generation of families repeated the same ritual in nearly identical form. A parent glancing at a watch near the food court, a child emerging from KB clutching something small and inexpensive and entirely their own choice. Proud of it in a way that had very little to do with what the toy actually was. The company that built that ritual was never run by visionaries chasing some grand retail theory. It was built by two brothers who started out selling candy, stumbled into the toy business through an unpaid debt, and spent decades learning the trade one wholesale shipment at a time before ever opening a store of their own. What they created wasn't glamorous. It didn't need to be. A modest storefront wedged between the food court and the department store anchor, stocked with toys a working family could actually afford, was enough to become, for millions of American kids, one of the defining places of their childhood. None of that is what destroyed the company, and that's worth sitting with for a moment. KB Toys wasn't undone by a bad idea, or a founder who lost his way, or a generation of kids who simply stopped caring about toys. Its stores were full right up until the end. Its Christmas kiosks inside Sears sold through their inventory every single December, all the way to the very last one. The failure came from somewhere the shoppers digging through those bins never saw and never had reason to suspect. A set of financial decisions made in a boardroom. Years before any customer noticed a single shelf sitting emptier than it used to. The people who loved KB Toys weren't wrong about it. They loved a real thing, run by real people, that served its purpose honestly for as long as it was allowed to. What deserves to be remembered isn't a company or its balance sheet. It's the ritual itself, the specific, unglamorous, deeply American experience of a kid with a few dollars and 20 unsupervised minutes, believing completely that the next thing pulled out of a clearance bin might be exactly what they'd been looking for all along. That feeling didn't belong to any single store chain, not really. It belonged to a childhood, to a particular decade, to a version of the American mall that doesn't exist in quite the same way anymore. KB Toys simply happened to be the place where so many people felt it first. The stores are gone now, the buildings repurposed or torn down, the red bins sold off or thrown away years ago. But the people who dug through them are still here, telling their children about a feeling they can't quite explain, in stores that no longer stand. That, in the end, is what's left. Not a business, but a memory millions of people still carry, quietly, of a place that once meant something and mattered exactly as much as they remember it did.